Hi, welcome. I am Seth Misenar, and this is a talk on AI security standards and frameworks and regulation, and I title this Guardrails for Innovation. So this is me. I'm Seth Misenar. I've been an instructor and an author for SANS for quite some time. Been security consultant for 20 plus years. And most important and most relevant, I think, to this particular talk is that I am co-author with Eric Conrad of SANS Security 511 on advanced threat detection and monitoring. And we've recently added a pretty substantial chunk on generative AI and LLM application defense. And I'm super excited that I have been recently tapped by SANS for creation of a SANS AI Security Essentials class that's going to be coming in 2025. So super fun. So there are numerous potential standards. Now, I don't know that all of them would really constitute standards, but it is laudable that so many of the vendors and tech companies and industry folks and governments, everybody's dipping their toe into this because it's exploding very, very quickly. And right now we're certainly kind of down there at that bottom right with the XKCD comic of we got tons and tons of competing standards. And really, we still haven't sorted out how we're going to do this. Now, I would love, because I've been down that road, I would love to be the person that's like, develop the one universal standard or like tell you about this one magical universal standard, but it's not going to ever exist, right? There's always going to be competing standards. As with the famous quote from George Box, essentially all models are wrong, some are useful. And so we're going to try to highlight some of the more useful ones and some of the kind of rapidly developing ones. And one thing that you're going to find, I'd really like the way that Microsoft lays out their principles of responsible AI. And I really like that we have as the foundation of all of those principles is transparency and accountability. And we're going to see that that's certainly much needed. And regulatory compliance is trying to mandate some degree of transparency and accountability, but it's not all about regulatory compliance, as of course we know and we will see. First up, we're going to hit a couple of just quick security standards that have been around, for a little bit and they're rapidly evolving. We have the OWASP Top 10 for LLM, which is actually, by the time you look at this, I suppose it might have already been out of date because they're actually updating it in the same month that I'm giving this talk. So, do give a check. They're supposed to deliver the OWASP Top 10 for LLM version 2 in October of 2024, which is this month for me. But it's modeled, of course, after the famous OWASP Top 10 for web applications, and there's other various variations upon the theme. But they try to highlight, well, what are the most concerning things? What are the biggest risks? Number one on everybody's mind, and this is likely to be the case still, even OWASP version 2. You can check out their GitHub repo where they kind of give details on the voting and the communication about their OWASP Top 10 development just in plain sight. And it's still the overwhelming focus is on prompt injection. But there's a lot more going on here. And one of the things that I do like that they also offer as part of the standard is kind of this mapping of the top 10. So this mapping of the LLM top 10, it tries to give you a sense of, hey, imagine you've got an LLM application and think in terms of an LLM application, well, where do these various LLM top 10s apply? And one thing I think that's useful about this is because there's so many different ways of implementing or leveraging LLM applications. It could very well be that you are building everything from the ground up, but it's pretty unlikely. It's much more likely that you're going to be building on top of something that's already out there, like a foundation model. Maybe it's been fine-tuned, maybe not. Maybe you're going to use it off the shelf. So there's a lot of nuance. Maybe you're going to be leveraging you're going to be calling it via an API, but you're going to have your own front end in front of it. Maybe you're going to be having your users leverage ChatGPT. Well, each of those kind of can present a bit of a different threat model. And so this this layout of mapping the OWASP top 10 to a particular LLM application can kind of give you a sense as to where these things might come into play and how they might fit into considerations of securing these applications. One that actually just got updated last week, right? So hot off the presses. In fact, the update has the details, but if you, at least as of today, if you download their techniques and mitigations spreadsheet, it hasn't actually been updated for the October update. But that's MITRE ATLAS, and MITRE is certainly well known for the MITRE attack in our world. And MITRE ATLAS is modeled after MITRE ATT&CK, not super surprising here. And they have 14 tactics, I know, just like the MITRE ATT&CK, but we have a relatively paltry few techniques and sub-techniques compared to MITRE ATT&CK, but the things they do lay out, the techniques, the sub-techniques, and from the get-go, they're highlighting mitigations. I mean, we have 26 mitigations, and we have like, I don't know, like 90 or so, 91, something like that, techniques and sub-techniques combined. Like just, it's, not, that's a pretty substantial portion of those. They also really emphasize case studies, and with their most recent October update, MITRE has, as part of the Atlas project, they have created this like AI incident sharing database sort of thing. So, still hot off the presses, so we'll wait and see what that looks like. But, it's nice to see that MITRE is leaning in, and they are updating and iterating on this. Still some opportunity, still very nascent, as we all know, but nice to be able to use this, especially when MITRE ATT&CK is so incredibly popular and has just captured a mind share of a lot of security operations and threat intelligence folks. So yeah, as I said, MITRE ATLAS is modeled after MITRE ATT&CK. So you do have tactic numbers and technique numbers. One thing you'll see, if you ever see AML dot in front of the kind of expected tactic format or technique format or mitigation format, that's an indication that this is the MITRE ATLAS. It had a previous name of like, adversarial ML something or other. But so that's where that AML comes from. But it's very, they've got a lot of details. It's still rapidly evolving, of course, but like what I see, and I definitely think it's worth keeping your eye on, especially from my vantage point. The mitigations are very welcome. Highlighting and then framing them, and much like they do with MITRE ATT&CK, where they're connecting mitigations to particular techniques and sub-techniques. So you can see, well, if I'm overtly concerned about this particular activity, then, well, here are some potential mitigations that I can implement, as it were. A variation upon another theme, right? So we have a variation on the theme of OWASP top 10. We have a variation on the theme of MITRE ATT&CK, and now we have a variation upon the theme of the shared responsibility model that we find in cloud. And so this is from Microsoft, and they kind of piggyback on that shared responsibility model that lays out the cloud services, the cloud service delivery model of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. And normally when we're seeing the shared responsibility model in their format, it's really divvying things up between, well, what's the cloud service provider's responsibility and what's the end user's responsibility. Now, one little twist that's thrown in here in this one is we've got a third player in the space. Yes, we have the customer, right? The user, us, the client. We do, of course, have Microsoft, and some things are shared, but there's also the model developer that comes into play. And that's especially in the PaaS world. So in the IaaS space, the way that they kind of characterize IaaS and map that to the AI world is they say, look, bring your own model. So you're bringing your own model with you, you're going to run it on your own VMs, that sort of thing. And then effectively everything's your responsibility, right? Now, when you move to PaaS, then it's really emphasizing you're going to leverage models that are there, that are already hosted in Azure, and you're going to be, you're going to be leveraging those as they are. And so this is where we find that, yes, we have some security responsibilities and AI responsibilities. of course, Microsoft does, but there's also going to be some dependence on the models themselves. So, for instance, if the models were, poorly aligned or poorly controlled, and Microsoft deployed it as is, then, well, it's going to mirror that same sort of reality. And then they have kind of their version of SaaS, which is co-piloting all the freaking things. And that's kind of their SaaS application, where we have very limited responsibility, that's our share. Substantially more, of course, is Microsoft's share. Let's pivot now to something different that is not necessarily a variation on the theme, and that's the EU AI Act. This is also fairly hot off the presses. It was passed, back in kind of spring of 24, but became law proper in August of 2024. We're still not yet at the point where we actually have enforcement. I'll highlight that a little bit later. And the kind of overarching goal is to try to establish some baselines that are going to allow for trustworthy AI, responsible, trustworthy AI. And of course, they're concerned about the EU market. But given what's that long arm of much like the long arm of GDPR, that long arm of regulation where, hey, if you happen to not be based in the EU, but you're serving EU customers or clients, even if they're in the US, well, then this still might be applicable to you, just like GDPR. So there's, it's much more widely applicable, even though it's the EU AI Act. It has implications for a much broader base than that. One of the core things that they do that I think is useful is they differentiate the providers, developers of AI systems from the deployers, users. And I think it's useful to frame it that way because there are different levels of responsibility and there are different expectations on each of those actors. And certainly at this point in the EU AI Act, there's much more responsibility, much more burden on the developers, providers of those AI systems than is what we would find on the actual users and deployers of the system. One of the things that the EU AI Act does is it leverages a risk-informed regulation. That's how I characterize it anyway. And I think this is useful, rather than, well, I'll step back. I'll step into that in a bit. They have these gradations of risk, and at the very tippy top are things that are just verboten. They're unacceptable. These are prohibited AI practices. If there's certain things that you're just not allowed to do, and under the EU AI Act. Then we get to the high, and high is really where I would say the majority of the EU AI Act is focused, is on defining what are the expectations associated with high AI systems, high risk AI systems, what constitutes a high risk AI system, and then, how to go about those, how to go about implementing those requirements. There's also a section on transparency requirements. Then we get down to minimal risk, which really doesn't come up much. And then at the very bottom, we see these GPAIs, general purpose AI models. And to me, that really screams foundation model. And those kind of get a separate call out because they necessarily can have a bit of a much wider reach because so many AI applications and AI systems will be built on top of them. But the GPAIs themselves have some degree of requirements, but it's really in kind of the implementation of them that comes into play as to whether the system will be characterized as high risk or something like that. So first up, we have prohibited AI practices, and a lot of the emphasis is really on harm, harm to individuals, potential for mistreatment, manipulation, exploitation, stratifying or classifying people based on behaviors that the AI system, it's pretty dark stuff. So lots of emphasis on manipulation and exploitation of vulnerabilities of more vulnerable groups potentially. And then also there's something you'll see related to social scoring, where it's as if the AI system is going to look at and classify behaviors that you exhibit, and then kind of classify and evaluate you based on those and based on your personal characteristics. There's also a prohibition on trying to discern with AI emotional states in workplace or academia, except insofar as trying to determine if there are medical or safety issues. There's some other prohibited practices that I don't really dig into here that are focused really on biometrics. So there's certain classes of biometrics that are prohibited, and some of them are, well, one that comes into play that's kind of we've seen an AI shop is on the business end of a 30-something million euro GDPR fine for violating one of what would be an EU AI Act prohibited practice, which is building a facial recognition database based on image scraping from the internet. That's a prohibited practice. There's other sorts of biometrics that are also prohibited in certain use cases. I would submit that the bulk of the EU AI Act is focused on those high-risk AI systems, and they've got like a totally separate annex to the EU AI Act that digs into what they characterize as the high-risk use case areas. Now, one thing to note, the way that they've structured that by taking that out of the EU AI Act and making it a separate document, to me that signals that this is likely to be a living, breathing document that is more likely to be updated than the text of the EU AI Act itself. So right now, we've got some overt callouts on use cases that would constitute high risk. I give the categories that they fall in, but you really need to look at the Annex 3 to dig in and kind of discern whether your particular use case is going to constitute a high-risk AI system. And one of the ways that they think about this and they suggest is that it's the function and the purpose of the AI system that's going to determine the risk. So it's how you're actually wielding it, how you're actually using it, that's going to tip it over that edge to make it a high-risk use case. There's, if you are found to have a high-risk AI system, there's many more expectations and requirements placed on you. We also have transparency obligations that are called out associated with the EU AI Act. And this is, it's a lot of trying to make, from the provider side of things, it's primarily focused on trying to make clear that AI has been used. So if you have a human-facing AI system, people are interacting like a chatbot or something like that, they have to be informed that they're interacting with AI. So overtly tell them, that's no big deal. Something that is potentially going to be problematic. There's a lot of language in there that kind of hedges because of the technical capabilities, but there is an expectation on being able to watermark or label AI-generated content or AI manipulated content. Now, what I've heard most people highlighting about the EU AI Act is the audio, the image, the video, and not a lot of people are talking about the text, even though text is overtly called out in the EU AI Act. And I think one of the reasons is because some of the language in there makes it clear that you can get a bit of a pass, it seems like, if kind of the current state of the art, current state of technology is not such that it can be pulled off. And I think that's kind of where we are, at least currently. OpenAI supposedly had a model that they could use for automatic identification of GPT generated text. And they had it, they never released it. They later came back and said, yeah, it really didn't work that well. So this is going to be hard, especially with text, but the others as well. This is something that can be, this could be manipulated. If you're a deployer, so someone that's actually leveraging these AI systems, not just building them, then anything that's going to be associated with or speaks to a deepfake implementation has to be overtly disclosed. Now, to me, when I hear deepfake, it always makes me think nefarious use cases. And so, yeah, that's kind of my expectation. But it's worth a look at the EU AI Act's definition, because they overtly define deepfake in the EU AI Act. So you can make sure that your use case wouldn't fall afoul of that. they do have those GPAI systems, those general purpose AI systems. And to me, this sounds like foundation models. And it especially sounds like that because then they have a call out for quote unquote high impact GPAI that pose systemic risk. So you have regular GPAIs and then you have high impact GPAIs that could pose systemic risk. And the way that you determine if it's systemic risk is if it has high impact capabilities or it has used a whole bunch of processing in the training. So they actually call out overtly this, if it's more than 10 to the 25th power flops in the training of the system. That's kind of odd, right? But on the high impact capabilities, I think that's less objective, but they do call out things that would come into play, like the number of parameters, the token windows, the context window, completion window, the training cost, the training energy, the amount of time, as well as benchmarks and evaluations that are assessing the various AI systems. And then, lastly, the number of businesses and the number of end users that are leveraging these GPAI. If it's huge, widely deployed general purpose AI system, then the expectation is it's more likely to be perceived as high impact. Now on the implementation, nothing is enforced as of yet. First enforcement is going to drop in February of 25, and that's where those prohibited practices, now those are enforced. So if you are found in violation of those, you can look down at the bottom and see some penalties there. There's also an expectation of February 25 for AI literacy. So if you're a deployer or a developer of AI systems, then there's kind of an expectation of having AI literacy that is offered for your employees, for your people, to try to make sure that they understand kind of AI. And then we really jump to August of 25 is gonna kick off some of the GPAI systems. And then the biggie is August of 26. And August of 26 is when high risk AI systems and transparency, and really August of 26 is when kind of the act itself generally is reaching its enforcement date. So that's where kind of everything comes into play. Now, there's some enforcement bodies. I'm not going to dig into those in heavy detail. There's some at the EU level that are kind of for oversight, but also they seem to have more play in the GPAI space. The national authorities, you have the National Competent Authority, which is kind of the enforcement, penalties, monitoring. Then you have the notifying authority, and their job is really to, it's a government, both of those are government bodies. And the notifying authority's job is to designate, assess, and monitor the notified bodies. And the notified bodies are independent groups that are actually going to be assessing especially high-risk AI systems for conformity with those requirements that are set on high-risk AI systems. Now, non-compliance can be costly, and it's especially costly if you are non-compliant with the prohibitions in those prohibited practices, those unacceptable risks. You're found that to have run afoul of those, you're looking at 35 million euros or 7% of global revenues, whichever is greater. Now, other non-compliance, now this would be high-risk AI systems, this would be GPAIs, really everything else it has a lower bar, 15 million euros or 3% of global revenues, whichever is greater. I do like that they give this extra little call out here and they say, hey, just throwing it out there, but if you provide inaccurate, incomplete, misleading info to your regulators, then 7.5 million euros or 1% of global revenues, whichever is greater. And I kind of like that, just like, hey, by the way, transparency is kind of important, and accountability and being honest kind of important. Now let's pivot, and the last standard we're going to hit on is NIST AI RMF. Now AI RMF it's voluntary, like no one is required to adhere to it at this point. They highlight the principles of trustworthy AI and kind of lay those out, and then they provide what they consider to be and what is a very structured approach to risk management with AI-based systems. So they NIST has the RMF, but this is a really significant difference, and it focuses on the AI RMF. Now, four core pillars, four core practices. You have governance, mapping, measuring, managing, and each of those has kind of overt call outs on practices or things that have to be done in association with those various pillars. Now, in addition to the kind of core AI RMF, there is also the AI RMF Playbook. And it's kind of wild because I want to say the AI RMF is it's like close to 50 pages, but the AI RMF Playbook is like 150 or 200 pages. It's much, much bigger. And the RMF Playbook, it digs into like kind of how you might do things. It digs into, it tries to really, to me, it really tries to make the RMF a bit more actionable. Well, not a bit more actionable, but more relatable. It gives you kind of circumstances and kind of examples of how it might be put into practice, various actions that would be suggested as associated with this. Now, none of these, I mean, AI RMF in general is not mandatory, but the RMF Playbook is even less so. It's just kind of like a bit, it's just trying to help elucidate the sense, the spirit behind the AI RMF, and help you figure out and try to see, like, what are they after? Like, what's the intent here? How does this make sense? It's also littered with tons and tons and tons of references. So it's split up according to those pillars. And then every single one of those pillars, they each have their individual actions that are expected or objectives that are expected on them. And each of those has kind of examples and practices and reference documents that it highlights. So really, really robust, thorough companion guide. I'm a old school D&D nerd, and to me, like when I first looked at this, I was like, so this is like the Dungeon Master's Guide, right? This is like the DM guide, like hey, how do you actually implement this and put this into practice? And it kind of makes some sense. Now, I love the slide. This picture gets me every time. I think it's amazing. And one of the things to highlight is, I read a phrase recently that I thought it really stuck with me. It highlighted the rapid pace of innovation in AI, and it was characterized as an indigestible rate of change. Things are moving so incredibly fast, and there's so many different players in this space, and so many different apps, and so many different use cases, and stuff is dropping all the time, and it's just absolutely impossible to keep up with all of this. And that's exciting. Like, that's absolutely exciting. It's thrilling. And, we've seen as our models have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, just new capabilities have come about, which people didn't necessarily anticipate. And that's that concept of emergence that you might have heard of. But one of the things to highlight is, with this kind of indigestible rate of change, we want to make sure that we can continue to innovate. And if we run afoul, and just if our models, if our tech just totally runs afoul of kind of human principles, then it's easy to imagine a scenario where you're going to have some absolute regulatory overreach that's going to impose significant restrictions. And there's been kind of intimation of that throughout the world and throughout standards, but we do need guardrails. We need guardrails, and these guardrails are going to help us, despite the indigestible rate of change, the guardrails are going to help us kind of wrap our head around it, at least a sense of what types of things should we be considering. How can we try to, at the same time, have these guardrails, but not stifle innovation to allow this to blossom as it has for the past 2 years plus. And I think it's super exciting, and I love all the changes that are happening. It's just very exciting times for sure. So hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you can keep on innovating, but also do it safely. So thank you.